Thank you so much for joining today's See You on the Weekend webinar titled Face to Face with the Radical Right. We're going to be starting in just a couple minutes to get everyone logged in. Thank you so much for your patience.
Welcome everyone to See You on the Weekend. We are still seeing some folks logging in, so I'll wait just a few more seconds and then we'll get started here with an intro. All right, so welcome to See You on the Weekend. This is an ongoing series of lectures featuring cutting-edge research and creative work from CU Boulder's world-class faculty. Today's webinar is titled Face to Face with the Radical Right. My name is David Means, and I'll be your moderator. I'm the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which sponsors this series. We're so glad you could join us for today's virtual program. Just a few logistics before we get started. Attendees may submit questions by clicking on the question and answer or Q&A button located at the bottom of the Zoom window. These will be sent to the presenter and the moderators for their consideration and will not be visible to other audience members. Due to the size of the audience, and we do have more than 420 registrants today, the chat function has been disabled for this talk. We may not have time to get to your questions, but we'll certainly do our best to address the themes and ideas that are most common. So please do feel free to submit those throughout the talk. That'll give us a chance to group them and see which ones are popular, which ones there's a lot of interest and so forth. So also the webinar is being recorded, and by Monday, we will add a link to the recording on our website, which is where you registered for this program. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Benjamin Teitelbaum is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs. Professor Teitelbaum received his PhD from Brown University and a bachelor's in music from Bethany College. Prior to joining the CU Boulder College of Music, he was the head of our Nordic Studies program. He's received a number of honors and awards, including the Joukowsky Family Foundation Outstanding Dissertation Award, the German Institute for the Study of Radical Movements Applied Research Award, and the Richard Waterman Prize for the Study of Popular Music. In 2020, he received the Provost Faculty Achievement Award. He's published 2 books and op-eds in numerous major publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and he has contributed his expertise to news pieces by National Public Radio, Swedish Radio, and the BBC. Professor Teitelbaum specializes in Swedish folk music and tours nationally and internationally as a performer and teacher. I think I'm going to say this right, and teacher of the Nyckelharpa, Sweden's unofficial national instrument. We are lucky to have Professor Teitelbaum with us today, and I am pleased to welcome him to CU on the Weekend.
Thank you so much, David, and it is a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm going to share a PowerPoint as I speak with everyone this afternoon. So in spring of 2019, just about this time of year, I was walking along a street without sidewalks in Oro Valley, which is a plush northern suburb of Tucson, Arizona. I'd later learn, and it did not occur to me at the time, that I stood out like a sore thumb. In fact, one person put it to me. I was walking down the street with the palm trees, the heat, everything that is Tucson that time of year, in a long black coat with black leather boots, black pants, and gloves in my pocket. You see, I had flown from Colorado that morning, flown with a one-way ticket, bought just an hour before the plane left. And having come from Colorado, where it was, of course, in springtime cold, I was prepared for a much different climate. But I had to get down there quickly. This had been my life for going on a year at this point. Of chasing someone around the world, of reacting oftentimes at the last minute to invitations to come and speak, to observe some sort of gathering, meeting, demonstration. And this was at a particular time where I was feeling like I was making headway with a particular person who I wanted to learn about and who was telling me a story I was quite interested in. So I was walking down the sidewalk, this road without a sidewalk, rather, in Oro Valley, in what probably should be called a retirement community. And I came to the address that I had been given. I knocked on the door, was greeted by a friendly face, an offer of coffee, which I accepted. And I proceeded through the house, past 2 big woolly dogs, onto a patio behind the house, next to a pool, and finally to a set of chairs underneath an umbrella. And sitting across from me was Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon, who is the former advisor to Donald Trump, the former campaign chairman for Trump's successful 2016 presidential campaign, as well as the former CEO of Breitbart Media, and a strategist and collaborator with various voting data initiatives surrounding the Brexit vote in 2016. I'd been interviewing him for about a year at this point, and he had just started telling me a story that had shocked me, a story I did not frankly understand why he had chosen to share with me. It was about secret meetings he had had with a Russian operative, a Russian ideologue named Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is known to those who know him in most instances as a rabid anti-American, ultra-conservative political operative and philosopher in Russia, one who has stoked radicalism in Putin's Russia and in many times served as a sort of mouthpiece for warmongering against both Ukraine and Georgia. All of that fitting into a larger agenda on his part to see global liberalism, democracy spreading from the United States, contained, and shackled in a way that would allow for other world powers to rise up, most notably a union between China and Russia. So this is a figure who would seem to be diametrically opposed to all precedent and all status quo in US foreign policy. And yet Bannon felt an affinity with him. They felt an affinity over a philosophical and ideological interest and association they each had with a strange, radical, we should call it a spiritual school called traditionalism. The two of them met on the basis of that shared interest, that shared ideological interest, but Bannon also was using it as an opportunity to try and change this Russian operative and influencer's mind about the United States, and perhaps to work on bringing the two of them together. This is what Bannon said to me that particular day in Tucson.
Different sets of values. The question gets to be to Dugin, as a traditionalist, are the values of the traditionalists more in line with, and not modernity, but are they more in line with the substrate of the Judeo-Christian West, or is it more in line with the kind of totalitarian, mercantilist Confucian values of what's going to control the Eurasian landmass?
Did you pose that question?
Absolutely. This is what we talked about for hours.
Yeah. What did he say?
I wasn't looking for an answer. I remember it was the first meeting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he did most of the talking until it was about 3/4 of the way through that I kind of turned and drew my fire running.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
After I let him talk out for a while. But no, because he's a brilliant guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think he had two glaring blind spots. The one glaring blind spot, he kind of misses the point about America. He completely missed the point. Like the whole Trump thing was like this huge revelation and this fight. I said, but that really is America. That is the power of the working class. That's the power of the, it's this conflict we have in the United States and the conservative movement and others about, we're considered and we're denounced by the Wall Street Journal's editorial page as the blood and soil wing of the Republican Party versus, and this is a very fundamental thing. I'm a huge believer that we're a country with a border and a wall in a country that has a culture and a civilization and citizens and an Americanness to it all, right? And that's a country. If that's called blood and soul, then so be it. But we're a country. We're a thing, right? With a people and a set of customs and traditions. We're not some idea. I hate that concept. America's an idea. That's a heritage, Cato. That gets us into all the spreading. That gets us into all these wars with these people that want to walk around with this kind of this airy-fairy idea of democracy and be jamming it down the throats of people in Kabul. 16 years at $2 trillion, 3,500 deaths, 15,000 wounded in $2 trillion. That's America, the idea. Right. So it was to convince him, number one, he's dead wrong in that America is not the enemy. America is actually the central part of the Westphalian system. We have these robust, strong nation states, united in some sort of alliance. And that
so in addition to getting a repeat installment, let's say, of the way that Bannon speaks and the way that he shifts subjects, and that it typically is just a hurricane of words and ideas that I, a scholar, had to sift through. It was also one instance when I felt like I got some deeper knowledge about not just his actions, but his ideas and the way that he was working in pursuing projects that surely would have shocked journalists who were already skeptical of this figure. It was the type of thing, however, that I've been doing for almost a decade at that point. But prior to my work with Bannon, you see, since about 2010, I have been doing this type of work, face-to-face interactions, long-term exchanges, close conversations with figures who might broadly be grouped under the heading of the radical right. And that is, as David and Emily mentioned, what my talk is about today. I'm going to describe some of the background for how I work, why I work, what I'm hoping to achieve, and what I think that I have achieved as a scholar. But I'm especially looking forward to a Q&A session that will follow this presentation. Now, when I talk about the radical right, to begin with. That's a term that is not especially dear to me. It's one that I use interchangeably with others. I will sometimes refer to the radical right as radical nationalism. I'll sometimes describe it as the extreme right, right-wing extremism, sometimes white nationalism, sometimes neo-fascism. But in most cases, I use the first set of terms, radical right or radical nationalism, to refer to political causes, contemporary political causes, that are seeking dramatic curtailments of liberalism in order to protect the integrity of variously conceived nations or groups of people who could be a nation. Within that heading, people who seek dramatic curtailments of liberalism to promote a national community or nation. Within that heading, there's a wide range of actors who I'm interested in studying. That includes people who are militant. That includes people alternately who turn to politics and democracy to try and pursue their ends. It includes people who define the nation state that they believe is threatened, or the national community that they think is threatened, primarily in racial terms, who would be proper white nationalists and say that the threats that they are seeking to fight back against are threats that will weaken the racial purity of an organization, of a community. Alternately, there are those who say that the integrity of the population itself and its integrity deals more with either cultural distinctiveness or political sovereignty in some way. A slightly more moderate version of this radical right or radical nationalist world. All of them, however, have experienced these past decades as a period of time when they have advanced, when they have made progress in terms of politics that, especially following World War II, they did not think was possible. And arguably the rise of more moderate democratic forms of this type of nationalism is been the most transformative political phenomenon of the past decades, at least for Europe and North America, as well as I think the Indian subcontinent. So that's who they are. Who am I? I am, as David mentioned, introducing me, a professor both of ethnomusicology and international affairs here at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm a Colorado native. I am politically, you might be interested to know, someone who's always considered myself on the left, somewhat uninterestingly. I almost wish that my politics were as dramatic or dramatic in such a way that it might match that of the people I study, but I'm afraid it's not. I fit rather neatly into the stereotype of a Boulder professor. And yet those differences have come to be resources in my mind, certainly hurdles, but also tools to gain a deeper understanding. Now, I told you earlier what I would like to cover in this brief overview before we turn into a wider conversation about my experiences. These are the things that I want to cover: a who, what, why, and how, essentially. Who are they and who am I? Well, I gave you an introduction to that. I also want to tell you what it is that I want to learn about them. I want to talk about why I want to learn it, why I think it's important. And I want to describe a thing or two about how I do that, the methods that I've chosen to pursue here. And I'll end by discussing a little bit about the results of my research as I see it so far. So I've talked to you about the actors involved. I can add that for most of my research, the past decade, most of that research is focused on Europe. I've been particularly interested in Scandinavia and in Sweden. This is a place that paradoxically was one of the last in Europe to receive a full-blown nationalist populist party inside of its government, or at least inside of its parliament. That's paradoxical because at the same time as there was not a lot of representation of the radical right within formal politics in Sweden, Sweden was also home to a raging, explosive underground radical right, extremist right scene, centered in large part around music making and skinhead subculture. So a lot of my early interest as a scholar was studying that from a perspective of music, but also seeing how that was transforming. Because as we look at Sweden today, it's home to a quite robust nationalist party called the Sweden Democrats the fastest growing party in Swedish modern political history. So that has occupied me for quite some time, but that research gradually bled into my more recent projects, which have been following not only Steve Bannon, this Russian figure Alexander Dugin, but other figures around the world who shared this particular mindset and interest and affiliation with esoteric religion and esoteric politics, and their very uncanny rise to positions of soft power in a number of major hotspots for global populism: Brazil, Russia, the United States, Hungary, and so on. I'll tell you what it is that I seek to learn, because it's something different from that of other scholars of the radical right. Typical research on the radical right focuses on, let's say, voting data, policy proposals, voter demographics, institutional history, the way that political parties have formed and transformed, the economics, the funding mechanisms of these groups. In many cases, to put an umbrella on all of that, most research on the radical right is interested in macro issues, generalizable data that can be used to compare radical right movements in different countries and different continents, because this is in many cases a sort of global phenomenon working as one. Alternately, if you moved outside of the world of political science, you might see, let's say, in sociology departments, a lot of interest in aspects of violence, maybe in socialization into far-right extremist groups or militant groups or things of that nature. My approach is more oriented to the discipline of anthropology, which is a sort of parent discipline to my discipline of ethnomusicology. I am interested in understanding what these people think and feel. I'm understanding in what their visions are for the future, how they understand themselves, how they understand the world around them, and the relationship between the two. It is not macro, but micro data, you could say, that I'm interested in. What some scholars might dismiss as anecdotal or personal or a sort of meaningless detail. That is what really captivates me. Now, in saying that I want to learn to essentially see the world through the eyes of the people who I study, that to say that I am wanting to focus on details of their biography, of their life, of what they listen to in the car, where they live. There's also behind all that a sort of assumption on my part that all of that information matters. And with that as a backdrop, I'll move to this next point and talk to you about why I want to learn learn more about this particular body of information. Most of the time, scholars of the radical right, like myself, will justify their actions by saying that they are conducting research in order to stop the phenomena that they are studying. And in this sense, it's almost like criminology in sociology. We study a social problem so that we might be better suited to address it and undermine it and stop it. And certainly on an emotional level, I feel that in many cases. However, to lay things out in that way is to put the cart before the horse, in my mind. I think that the study of the radical right is somewhat unique, both in the university world and in popular journalistic settings, in that there is a lot of writing, a lot of commentary on it, a lot of opinions about it, but also a lack of access to the individuals themselves and a lack of insight into the very types of details I just mentioned. It is yes, in my mind, a field that is consumed by broad generalizations, but oftentimes without awareness of how that all lines up with the actual lives of the people inside of it. So it is a sort of academic and intellectual mission for me, first and foremost, and a political cause only thereafter, as best as I can postpone those instincts on my part, I try to do that. It is a way to try and discover something new that is right in our midst. The fact that people who participate in these causes are in many cases neighbors, if not next door neighbors, than people living in broadly in the same society as us, and yes, yet they are so unknown to many scholars and journalists. So I aim to seek out and find those details. If there is a bias in my work, it is a bias toward information that will trouble prevailing narratives, categorizations, classifications, assumptions, and stereotypes, and hopefully information that will stop us in our tracks and force us to embrace something that is, I think, is all too rare in the study and the commentary on the radical right, namely curiosity. That is what I want to learn, and it's both again for the benefit of research just on its own right, but I also think that in the long run that this can help our political causes as well. So I just want to make sure I had one. Excuse me, sorry, I just got a question in the chat here. Now, a big piece of my work, something that distinguishes my work, is not just that interest, but the methodology that suits and attempts to learn and to gain insight about those details. The method that I focus on, that I try to embrace most as a scholar, is ethnography. Some of you may be familiar with that term. Ethnography is most often associated with anthropologists, but it is the prevailing methodology for ethnomusicologists, the discipline that I gained my PhD in. Ethnography literally means writing about culture or writing culture. We think of it as being a discipline centered on gaining an understanding of a particular culture group and how they view themselves in the world, accessing their perspective. We'll say sometimes today the insider perspective. Historically, we might have said the native's perspective. Because in many cases, ethnography was a methodology used by wealthy Westerners going to study in some cases, disenfranchised or colonized or indigenous peoples, and writing about them and producing knowledge that was then taken back to the West. The methodology is used in many different ways today. It retains its typical focus on trying to see the world through the eyes of the people who you are studying. It also tends to involve prolonged contact with the people themselves. It is like investigative journalism. That might be what is most familiar to most of us if we think about ethnography, where you have a researcher returning to a community or a small group of people over and over again and trying to be as involved in their lives as they will allow, essentially. But with the added feature for ethnographers being not just dialogue with academics, but I think also the time span. Some ethnographies last a decade and involve 10 years, or more worth of scholars living among the people who they study. And whereas oftentimes in journalism, there is a high premium placed on objectivity and on distance, on being close in one sense as a journalist, but also trying to not let yourself and your emotions become entwined with those of the people you're studying. In ethnography, there tends to be a sort of unspoken antithesis of that. The value, part of the end product, or the tool, we might even say, for ethnographers to gain their insight is to establish relationships with the people you're studying, to get to know them. It's in one reason that ethnographers are often eager to share the fact that they have become friends with the people they're studying, and normally that's politically and socially unproblematic. But that underlies the fact that that closeness, relationships rather than objectivity, is really what the goal is, especially if you're trying to empathize in a sort of value neutral sense, to empathize, to see the world through the eyes of the people you're studying. Now, this is exactly what I've tried to do. And in my case, it's not politically or socially advantageous to share the fact that that I get close to or have even become friends with some of the people that I study. On the contrary, it's detrimental, dangerous, unsettling, and scary. But if the moral, ethical, social aspects of that seem troubling to us, the epistemological aspects of it, the aspects that relate to learning, those don't change in my mind, depending on which community you're studying. It still is of value to put your efforts into getting close to them if you want to understand the sorts of things that I am pursuing here, if you want to see how they see the world. So I continue with that effort, despite some quite considerable downsides. And let's turn to that for a moment here. What are the results of my work? Access has been one of them. Access has been perhaps the greatest byproduct of researching in the way that I have. This is an image here from actually earlier in 2019, before I had that meeting with Steve Bannon in Arizona, where we are all praying before dinner at his house behind the Supreme Court, his townhouse in Washington, D.C. You'll see me here on the left next to former Trump speechwriter Darren Beatty. At the head of the table, you'll see Steve Bannon himself. Straight across from me is a figure who's probably less familiar to many in our audience today. This is Olavo de Carvalho. This is the unofficial guru of Jair Bolsonaro. Like Steve Bannon, has a past affiliation with traditionalism, and that was my interest in him. It was settings like these and conversations like this when I gained access to information, insights that I do not think I would have accessed otherwise. And that certainly is something that has always been encouraging to me. It hasn't just been access alone, though, access for its own sake, that I've come to value. One person who I've spent a lot of time studying in my first book focuses on largely is a man named Mattias Karlsson, who's the chief ideologue for the Sweden Democrats political party in Sweden. He has written most of their party platforms. He also has been interested in aspects of activism outside of parliamentarianism, outside of formal politics. And he has a background loosely in skinheadism, in skinhead subculture, and yet pulled himself out of it. I've gotten to know him quite well. I do consider him a friend, even though we fight fairly often about politics. And in the course of our interactions, I did come to gain more respect for how varied, I hate to use the word since it's so worn at this point, but how complicated his thinking is. And also the ways that how one political cause in one setting can be quite radical, but taken into another setting, it's not. In the context of Sweden, which is a political context dominated by social democracy, that essentially has all political parties fighting over who can be the most effective steward of a welfare state. It takes relatively little leaning to the right to become a radical in this case. And that certainly came to illustrate my understanding of him. Through many discussions, I've come to almost see him as being a more conservative Democrat, almost something like akin to Bill Clinton. In most of his visions, perhaps slightly more conservative, but not much. I sometimes think of Joe Manchin of West Virginia when I'm trying to characterize his worldview. I brought him to Boulder once. I teach courses on this subject, and he came to speak to my students once. And I recall it was in the Obama administration, just when prohibitions against GLBT persons in the military were being picked apart. That was in the news, and when he heard that in the United States we were not allowing GLBT people to be in our military in the past, he laughed and said, "What a crazy country." All of that alongside a fairly, some might say, a fairly hard-handed, draconian even, call for curtailments of immigration to Sweden. So those sorts of mixtures and combinations of perspectives are easier to come by, I think, and I think laid bare to you when you spend more time speaking to and having exchanges with these people on a face-to-face basis over many, many years. But everything that I've described so far, at least in so much I've divulged to you, has been relatively easy on me personally. But there are other moments in my research when things have been quite complicated, and the fact that I've been studying people and commenting on people with whom I have a relationship, in many cases a productive relationship, has become very, very challenging. In 2011, you may recall there was a massive terrorist attack in Norway outside of Oslo, perpetuated by a man named Anders Behring Breivik. This involved a bombing of a governmental building in central Oslo, and then close range murder of 68 children on an island in a lake north of the city at a summer camp. And it was perpetuated by this man, Anders Behring Breivik, who did it in order to, as he saw it, push back against liberalism, cultural Marxism, immigration, and Islam, and its so-called encroachment on Norwegian society. I came into that story because in his sprawling manifesto, he wrote about a woman named Saga, a Swedish white nationalist singer who was absolutely ingrained into the skinhead subculture, the neo-Nazi subculture, even though she herself never donned that look or sang in that particular way. She sang light, airy pop music, and that was really what was appealing to him. He's in his manifesto, he talks about being turned off, not by far-right politics, but by far-right cultural style in the 1990s. And so he is attracted to the music, and in his manifesto, he writes extensively about how inspiring she was. So I was in this position at that time, in that moment of intense media scrutiny, to provide some information about Saga, about the singer, about the cultural milieu that she lives in, about the milieu where her music is exchanged. And I did that, and I felt that was an appropriate and responsible use of my scholarly expertise. However, it had some really devastating consequences on her personally. Of course, she had basically, in response to the shootings, begun to make her exit from the far right world and from far right music making. But the media attention also ended up costing her a job, costing her thereafter some housing, making her move. And I had close exposure to that whole story. And Saga was someone who I got along with quite well. Has an unbelievably complicated life story behind her. Her music that certainly doesn't excuse anything, but it adds context that would prevent me certainly from writing about her in the way that a journalist might. And so I came away from that situation feeling, yes, like I had done my job as an expert, but also personally and emotionally feeling distressed. And there are many other instances where the reverse might have happened, where simply being too close to these actors, to being close to them when something more extreme is taking place, ends up wearing on me emotionally and personally. That struggle, that strain, as real as it is, I also think is inherent to this method. It's inherent to deciding that you are going to study not texts, not stereotypes, not images on a TV, but real people who have complicated biographies, who have diverse interests, and also who, by virtue of coming in contact, will come to know me, and who I will begin to form a relationship with over time. As straining as it is, I also value it immensely. And on that note, hopefully that has given us enough of something to start having a conversation about. I could talk about all these subjects quite a bit longer, but I'm eager to hear your comments. So I'm going to stop my my share right now and turn things back to the moderators.
Well, thank you, Ben. We're getting a lot of good questions in here, and I would just remind folks that that little Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen with the two little comic book word bubbles, that's a great way to submit your questions, and we will collect those and integrate them into our conversation as we're able. So I think, Ben, I very much appreciated and recommend to folks your more recent book, which is focused on this work with Steve Bannon and other ideologues in Brazil and in Russia. Is there anything more you could say to kind of characterize your findings in terms of the way that this radical right, you know, the traditions you've been studying, the figures you've been studying, in terms of their influence within our world right now and how that has shifted recently over time as you've been tracking it? Like, what are your findings in terms of how these folks are positioned within our larger political and cultural world at the moment?
There were some interesting correspondences and should we call them coincidences perhaps among these figures. Steve Bannon, Alexander Dugin, and Olavo de Carvalho in Brazil, although he lives in Virginia, they all had a past not just looking at anti-establishment politics, but anti-establishment religion, anti-establishment science and knowledge, trying to find a way to reject everything that was conventional knowledge, everything that was the status quo. They were comprehensive dissidents in many different ways. Something perhaps about that has also made them, what should we say, has made practical politics and professionalism hard for them. They all have struggled to maintain positions and to maintain favor with the figures that they are trying to influence. You know, for Bannon, of course, quite dramatically and formally, that manifest in his falling out with Donald Trump and eventual exit from the White House, in his inability to keep collaborations going over the course of many years. Dugin has never really had any sort of formal partnership with Putin, although he's had partnerships with other benefactors and powerful politicians in Russia, and those two have always been fleeting. It's taken a short while until they've imploded. Olavo has always kept himself at a distance, and that has encouraged some staying power, I think, to his political influence. Although some of his appointees and allies in the Bolsonaro government have started to fall in rather dramatic fashion too. Something about being idealists and being opposed to compromise and pragmatism has had the effect that they've all had these tumultuous paths. Of equal interest, though, David, I think is to kind of look beyond the fortunes of any given figure. What is very strange to me is that some of the most radical ideas that I think in some cases are more radical than fascism at a very generic level, have popped up in figures close to populist leaders around the world at this moment, and they've been absent before. And I think we can ask our question about, well, what's going on there? Forget about the individual, but where are these ideas coming from? Why in this particular moment do we have influential people who, you know, people coming to positions of at least soft power, who are so devoted to looking beyond all sort of convention, who want to absolutely blow up the modern nation state as it exists right now, or globalization or liberalism as it exists right now. That's the bigger story, and that's what I'm interested in following.
Great. So there's a set of questions, a type of question coming in that a lot of folks have that I think has to do with sort of what motivates folks to, that folks find, you know, radical nationalism or the narratives of the radical right appealing. And one person posed this question: to what extent do you think conspiracy theories, generally false of, let me get this right, generally verifiably false views influence or drive the radical right? Do conspiracy theories have a role to play here?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. They're one expression, essentially almost of a strategic need for the radical right to be able to reject the status quo. And this is, I think, it's easier to associate with populism, actually, which is a largely overlapping but not completely overlapping phenomenon with right-wing radicalism. To be able to say that the establishment needs to be blown up and the establishment needs to disappear and be replaced. One way to make that case is to say that the establishment spreads false knowledge, right? And that they are spreading a false narrative of reality. And they do that through academics like me, and they do that through journalists, and also through official governmental informational agencies like the CDC. So to introduce a conspiracy theory really is to undermine prevailing understandings of truth and of knowledge. I mean, think of that as just a preparatory stage to making an attack of corruption, to say that the people in power right now are irredeemably corrupt and need to be moved out. That's one thing. You can also zoom out at a sort of a different level of distance and say that the need to question the status quo and reject it speaks to the fact that the radical right sees itself as an ultimate outsider still right now. That by rejecting the mainstream, by rejecting established practice, you are necessarily rejecting leftism in many cases. That's key to their self-understanding and their worldview. That's certainly an account of reality that I'm not sure all leftists would agree with. To see themselves as being at the helm of the establishment and always setting the agenda for conversations and for progress in the future. But that's certainly what the radical right does, and it's that perspective we see speaking through this tendency toward conspiracism.
Great. So another participant has posed another question related to the motivation for folks who subscribe to these ideologies. And here I'm reading their statement. Do you have a sense that people you are learning from suffer from a high level of fear or anxiety associated with people who they feel like are personal threats?
Sometimes not. I mean, I'll start with the former case. There are people who I've studied who have some traumatic encounter with, let's say, minority population in their childhood or in their teens. And there's a very, it's very easy to sort of do storytelling based on that. They grew up in a safe environment, and all of a sudden they had this conflict with multiculturalism, with globalization manifest, incarnate in an immigrant or something in Sweden. That's a pretty common life story. And from that point forward, they were awakened to the dangers of pluralism or something like that. That happens a lot. We know also that imagined or anticipated rather than experienced contact with diversity is a major motivating factor for voters voting for far-right parties and for Donald Trump in the United States. We've talked about the halo effect in some studies of voter demographics, that you'll see strongest support among people living close to but not among areas with large non-white populations. Whereas people living within sometimes the areas with non-white populations, the white voters living in the midst of non-white voters tend not to be that supportive of the far right. So you see some some indications of fear imagined fear, experienced fear, and so on. All that is kind of the easy stuff, though. The harder cases, the harder biographies to deal with are individuals who do not seem to manifest those qualities. I don't get the sense, for example, that Mattias Karlsson, the Sweden Democrat that I spoke to, I don't get the sense that he is necessarily fearful on an individual level of let's say of people who are different from him, at least no more than anyone else. He's marrying an immigrant right now at the end of next month to Sweden. That says anything about someone's broader kind of structural view in relationship to communities. But I don't see it there. And in those cases, with someone like that, where it doesn't always appear to me to be a gut level dislike, fear toward people who are different from them. Sometimes there are more elaborate explanations to be found there. It can be a rejection of certain tellings of history. That's one thing that Mattias talks about a lot, is that he really finds his voice in pushing back against what he considers to be the falsification of Swedish history. Those kind of social progressive, large scale discourses are what upset him in some way. It could be a false flag. It's very hard to tell, but again, at a gut level, to say that it's just that he's fearful of people who are different from him would feel somewhat unintuitive to me.
There are also questions having to do with religion and the relationship. I think you mentioned traditionalism and this common thread of traditionalism amongst some figures you've studied. Maybe you could, as a starting point, say something more about what traditionalism is and how important it is in this story you're telling about the radical right.
Sure. So it is a very small but recently influential stream of thought that at its birth was not about politics. So early in the 1900s, end of the 1800s, there was a small group of esoteric philosophers who looked to ancient world religions and developed a sort of critique against modernity, you could say. They looked at the world that they were living in, and they saw the increasing borderlessness of it. They saw an increasing faith in the future and tendency to condemn the past, to think that we're always going to progress and what comes next is going to be better, and the past is something to be overcome. They saw a breakdown of differences between people, both hierarchically, in terms of, let's say, economic social mobility, and they also saw a breakdown of social identities, and that accelerates more as years go by. So by that, I'm talking about feminism, seeing less stratified differences between men and women, and also ethnic and racial integration. There are also borders breaking down, and they saw that borderlessness, the faith in progress, as having been prophesized by some older religions, and which to boot, in their mind, also tended to agree with each other, and that they were all testament to the fact that ages ago there was once upon a time a true religion, a true tradition that had captured the truths and the mysteries of the universe, and it has gradually been forgotten. And in its place, we find ourselves working toward modernity, which manifests the opposite values that tradition would have, namely borderlessness and a faith in the future. That way of thinking, it has political undertones, but as decades went by, when you get past World War II, as you move into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a small little group of thinkers started to instrumentalize it for political purposes. And it really reaches a boiling point in the 90s with Alexander Dugin, this figure that Steve Bannon was talking to me about, who saw a real right-wing politics, a real anti-liberal politics as needing to be based in this, because he saw it as being the most comprehensive rejection of liberalism and modernity, rejection of the principles of liberty and equality and progress. Fascism, they would later come to think, had its own version of equality and progress built into it, that it was so futuristic in so many ways, and that it sought to establish at least some sort of equality if you were part of the nation, right? So fascism came to be seen to some of these thinkers as not being extreme enough, not being enough of a contrast to liberalism. And for that reason, they sought something more dramatic. And it was almost comically, comically outside of the mainstream. Part of what they were wanting to establish, these thinkers, was not just to see borders emerge around nation states, but to treat that as just a preparatory stage to something more, to seeing borders established within nation states, between men and women, stratified between different castes even, let's say, and always with those appealing to spiritual virtue or religious virtue being valued above those who appealed to material virtue. All of this is to say that they were in many cases idealizing a state that would be bounded, stratified internally, and theocratic, as opposed to a state with fluid boundaries, egalitarian, and primarily focused in its politics on economics, either if it's economic liberty on the liberal right or economic equality on the liberal left. That's how they looked at politics and what traditionalism meant to them. So very extreme, as I say, and yet in the past decade, really, we've seen three figures popping up in Brazil, the United States, and Russia to positions of prominence, always informal, often soft power, who were affiliated with, admired, associated with, identified with traditionalism. And there was also some earlier instances of that in Hungary. In all cases, though, as I say, what they were attempting to do in their actual conduct professionally tended to be pretty clumsy. And again, my interest is less in their personal fortunes, but in that rather, it's more in that broader narrative and that broader phenomenon, the fact that now this idea has become newly appealing to at least some influential people in ways that it hasn't been in the past. So that's just a bit about traditionalism. That's the subject of my most recent book.
Yeah, and so someone asked a very specific question about the relationship of these folks on the radical right to institutional religion as it is presently manifest. And I think that was sort of implicit in the description you just gave, but is there anything more to say about that? But how do these folks think about established churches of various kinds, and do they see that as they're part of that, or do they have a critique of those institutions?
Mm-hmm. Most of them critique the institutions. They treat religious institutions of today like modern institutions of all kind. They think that they tend to be hollowed out, spiritually vapid shells, and usually corrupt, and usually part of whatever prevailing ideology exists in society at large, rather than a counterweight to it. So as much as, let's say, the figures that I was mentioning identify with religion specifically, so Alexander Dugin calls himself an Eastern Orthodox, the Brazilian and Bannon both identify as really zealous Catholics. They also have robust criticisms of the establishment and the institution. Where things get even wackier is the fact that for most of them, at different times in their life, they will also say, yes, I'm a Christian, but I recognize that Christianity is an imperfect path to something deeper, something perhaps even pre-Christian. And this surprises a lot of people, but they also recognize the sort of validity, and sometimes equal validity, of some other religious teachings. I had an interesting conversation with Steve Bannon about, where he told me that he could have seen himself as well having become a Sufi Muslim, an esoteric Muslim mystic, in other words, that would have been in some way comparable to Catholicism. It just wasn't didn't happen to be the culture he was raised in, but he wouldn't see any real substantive difference between the two. And this relates to that concept I was talking about in traditionalism, that they see that there once was a true tradition, and they think that its teachings were scattered among some of the world's religions today in a sort of bastardized form. So, Catholicism is an imperfect pathway for them. Sufism can be sometimes, esoteric Judaism. Hinduism is often considered to be the best and the most integral because it is one of the oldest. But Olavo de Carvalho, the Brazilian, to the point, speaking about this dramatically ecumenical element of their religious life. In my book, I produced some documents that seem to suggest that he converted to Islam in the 1980s and took on an alternate name, Sidi Muhammad. Then also thinking that, well, Islam and Sufism, though they're great for me now, but this is really just one potential pathway to something back. And I would have to think that he thinks the same way about his Catholicism today, but I'm not sure. Haven't really had a transparent conversation about that with him. So yes, they identify as religious, but I don't think everyone knows just how much eccentricity rather is lurking underneath the surface there.
So there's a lot of questions. Folks are interested in more information about the folks that you study. And one question here is, how many non-white people do you study? And is whiteness, what's its relationship to this this group of radical right ideologues that you're
mm-hmm. This is a complicated question, because the issue is going to be, where do I draw the line? In Sweden, there are some, you'd be surprised, within the far right milieu, there are quite a number of people who identify as being not white and are still involved in it. So this includes some activists who are part Persian. This includes a Tunisian activist. So they are there. They're not especially prominent in these causes, though, no doubt. But when my initial thought, and why I think this is such a difficult question, is what exactly do I do with the Brazilians who I study? It was interesting when I posed a question to a leading traditionalist. Well, why are so many traditionalists white in the United States? And the response was, well, but think about the Brazilians; they're not white. So there are figures there. But if we think about whiteness more broadly as being a sort of not a phenotypical phenomenon, and not a biological phenomenon, but a sort of social phenomenon, people who are trying to affirm and rally behind social normativity, if some people might want to say privilege or hierarchical preference. It's something that all of these actors are striving to, despite whatever their ethnic or racial backgrounds may be. They're attempting to establish the rule and preference for previously empowered majority cultures within the nations that they're working on. So at another level of difference, you could say that everybody I'm studying is white. I'll leave that. It sounds to me like the person asking has some insight into that. So I'll let that last question be a little bit more of a philosophical quandary for them.
I think it's a good moment to shift to some of the Steve Bannon questions. We've gotten quite a few of those. One to begin is just, does Steve Bannon trust you, and why is that, if the answer is yes?
That's a good, yeah. The way that I would measure that is to see, what he divulged to me. I do not know why he shared the Alexander Dugin story with me that ends up becoming a centerpiece of my last book. And he he must have had some faith that I would be fair with that and I wouldn't sensationalize it too much by sharing that with me. So that says something. On other times, however, it was quite interesting because he would tell me something. I'd hear a phrase slip in one of those barrages of words, like you heard, and I gave that clip in my presentation. I'd hear him just drop a term that would let me know that he had read some author or he was familiar with some concept. And I would ask him about it later and he would deny knowing about it. And then I'd come back later and he'd speak about it again. And so I ended up getting the impression that I was receiving a slightly edited version of the truth from him, which speaks to some hesitancy. So, I'm not going to be able to give a plain answer. Did he trust me? Yes or no? But I think there was some qualified trust that came and went. As to why, the answers the explanations that I'm going to have, I think are going to sound a little self-aggrandizing to me. But I would like to hope that he felt like he was going to be treated fairly. I never concealed who I was or what I was doing. I think at times, I hope with the people that I'm working with, that they also see that there's a genuine interest on my part. I try to never study somebody if I'm not actually curious about them, if they're not actual open questions that I'm there to explore, for which I will accept and be able to live with a variety of answers. That might seem like a very low bar, but I feel, to be a little bit cynical, I feel like a lot of the research on the radical right does not begin with that type of curiosity and ask questions that it's not really interested in the answers for. So that genuine curiosity is, I think, speaks a lot. If you're really interested in learning about somebody else, and you're going to do the work to do it, and you're going to listen to them, and you're going to listen to them, hear as much as they want to say, that also flatters people, right? Attention flatters people. It flatters egomaniacs, people who have inflated egos like Steve Bannon. But it flatters, I think, the rest of us as well, to know that our lives and our thoughts are important to someone else. So I think there's something there. Again, it's a little self-aggrandizing for me to say that oh, I think he reacted to how genuine my curiosity was, but I do think that something of that is true and does communicate.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of a methodological, I guess a worry about this work and it's how your work is positioned within the larger political context and maybe unintended consequences of your research. Someone has posed the question, do the individuals you study and therefore get to know have an agenda they want to promote through you? And do you worry about providing a platform for things of augmenting messages or amplifying messages that these folks are wanting to get out to a wide audience? Absolutely.
It becomes more of a problem, less in my scholarship and my writing, and more so in media commentary, where you get 10 seconds, 20 seconds to characterize somebody or something. Then I worry that the sort of nuancing and chin stroking that I otherwise think is so important serves the practical purpose of just obscuring something that might be quite urgent and quite dangerous, and that needs to be spoken about in plain terms. If they wanted to beautify themselves, let's say, in my research, the response that I tend to have and the safeguard that I have is when I'm writing something long form is to lay out their ideas, to do it faithfully and accurately, and comprehensively. In most cases, a simple recounting of the ideas, of the agendas, of the actions, of the consequences is so much more powerful than any editorializing that I might do. It's so much more powerful, I think, than calling people fascists, to show what has actually taken place. The only time when that would not be the case is if they were really, really talented magicians, concealers of intent and action, and that hasn't been the case so far, in my opinion. Now we're just scratching the surface when I start to talk about this, though, because one challenge for me is that a lot of the figures, especially more recently who I've studied, I come to them after there's already a sort of media account and conclusion about who they are. And, by the time I'm meeting Steve Bannon, there had already been the Saturday Night Live skits of him as death controlling Donald Trump. There had even been a sort of post-mortem on his months in the White House that specifically said Steve Bannon is, he's not only evil, but he's a phony and he's stupid and uninteresting and just a charlatan. And when that is established, it's going to take relatively little from me to go in and produce some piece of commentary that functionally is going to appear to be normalizing or even beautifying of him. If any way I'm departing from that narrative in a direction that is in some way more favorable towards him, however we want to conceptualize that. That also could count as platforming, aiding, and yet it could also be the right thing to do. It could also be a matter of affirming what could be true about somebody against narratives that were formed from a distance and from actors who have different access to different information about them. So I try to not of course become a mouthpiece for the people that you're studying. I try to keep my voice there. I try to be comprehensive in my accounts. But I also try, as hard and as uncomfortable as it is sometimes, to not worry too much about how this is going to appear to the chattering journalist world, because I don't always think that they've got it right, and do not want to surrender that much of my voice and of my inquiry to their hasty conclusions, I think.
So I think there's two categories of questions that I'd love to turn us towards as we have like 20 minutes left, or 15 plus. Sure. With margin there. So those categories are about kind of practical implications as well as really personal connections. And we've got a great set of questions related to that. Before we go there, though, there's one larger question that someone has posed, which is a question about the radical left. And I think the question of, given your research and your understanding of what this movement is, what you think of as radical nationalism, the radical right, is there a symmetrical, analogy to groups on the left, or is there an asymmetry here? Like, how do you think about that in terms of the poles of this? And is there a radical left, this person has asked, and should that also be studied?
Everything should be studied. Yes, yes to that last question. No matter what, that's always my answer. Everything should be studied. But there is. I'm very distressed by the ways that the chess game during the Donald Trump years seemed to lead a lot of people to be enthusiastic about Antifa, as it's called in the United States. I think it should be called Antifa. Militant, self-identifying anti-fascist groups. What could be viewed as similar there is a willingness to use violence to pursue a political end, and I really do. I'm not eager to hear that relativized and rendered into something else. On the other hand, I don't think that the content and the ideas can be equalized always. There is something about the radical right. I do think it is crystallized in this traditionalist idea that I've been studying a little bit, that looks at all of the emancipatory causes of recent centuries with a great deal of contempt. So we're talking about minority rights, feminism, wholesale. That these are all processes that need to be rolled back. That that is a particularly dangerous idea, I think, in a lot of respects. I think that there can of course be dangerous ideas on the left as well. I don't know how to do a reckoning of them always. I dislike the mass organization and mass grouping of societies, sometimes the hostility towards ambiguity, the hostility towards also for people who do not fit into categories. That can also be found in various guises on the left, and is also very dangerous too. But in terms of just wanting to say, reckoning points between the two of them, I'm not sure that I can do that, other than to say that the far right, some of those reactionary agendas can be very, very incendiary, and probably shouldn't be compared to anything else.
So the dependence on social media, have you seen that change things as you've studied this question about, the relationship of the right to left and the appeal of these ideologies? With some people feel quite personally in terms of seeing this, in terms of new divisions within families, new divisions within friendships. Folks are providing some testimony related to those types of personal connections with what you're studying here. To what extent has social media and the internet played into the transformation of this movement into something that reaches into more contexts and more lives?
Well, it's allowed for marginal causes to spread. It's one of the challenges for the radical right throughout most of its post-war history has been networking and community building. And in a world, especially a pre-digital world, I mean, we were talking about concerts in many cases, mail order magazines, newspapers that were, sort of functioning as public squares for people living in different places. The internet accelerated all of that, and it also, I think, especially when we see social media replacing music as a primary activity, and almost the creation of visual culture, forming a new set of culture, a new way for people to converse with each other and make things together. All of that goes to community building. It helps people convert and ingratiate themselves in these causes more deeply, and thereafter to radicalize and mobilize. So I mean, I think that you probably don't need me to walk through those aspects of social media. That's fairly obvious. What is almost more interesting to me is not the rise of social media and the way that allowed for an acceleration of community building and also a transformation of the ways that they were expressing themselves. What's more interesting to me is what has happened recently after January 6th, when there was this mass purge, the symbolic purge of Trump from social media platforms. And then also this mass purge on Twitter of users. We saw just how important it was. Then I think we can all notice the sort of silence in media, the way that social media world was able to actually affect commentary on CNN. Certainly the two of them are connected. But what has been surprising is that we've seen, after the purges on Twitter, a huge exodus into alternative online and digital worlds and platforms. The thing that struck me the most was the app Telegram, which saw a surge of like 12 million users across the course of 3 days following January 6th. So we see that there's a very, very large mobile population, probably centered in the United States, that is going to continue finding ways to connect digitally, and that already is at the place that they're willing to take some pronounced actions as individuals in order to maintain those connections and the power that comes from them. So it has remained, it has been powerful. It's accelerated a process in the radical right. And it also shows some staying power even amidst some attempts at crackdowns.
So you mentioned January 6th, and there's a question here that I think transitions us to the question of how this is playing out in the United States. At this moment, we've got several questions that are along those lines. I'll just read this one. What is your opinion of the revelation that many of the people that took part in the January 6th Capitol riot are or were members of the US military?
Mm-hmm. Oh, just so can you tell me the question there? I mean,
so what is your opinion of that revelation or that information that so many folks who participated in that that invasion of the Capitol, that riot, that they had association past or present with the US military, and someone might add law enforcement generally as well?
yeah, there's a scholar at the University of Chicago who's looked at this in particular. Really, in the 1980s, this was a period of time in which we saw a lot of Vietnam vets actually going into ranks of, if not, let's say, this identity-based radical right that I'm talking about, then a broadly anti-government militant world. And that is so much larger, and its boundaries are so much more fluid than the radical right. That it's almost unsurprising that the activists that we would see and that we've seen in the Capitol riot appear in many cases to be coming out of that world. And this is probably intuitive, I think, for especially a lot of Americans who are listening to this. That's kind of part of our cultural landscape. So those actors sort of serve as a sort of common denominator for a lot of anti-government, right-leaning political causes. And the MAGA movement almost fits upon it. The Trump movement just is almost something that overlaps with it quite broadly, and all of its internal factions. White nationalists, explicit white nationalists, often will collaborate with or move in the same social or geographic arenas as those actors, and share a lot of exchange with them. But if I could, David, I feel like there's a more perhaps a more important point to stress here than just the fact that we see some social overlap. When Trump's movement came, and when we had the January 6th events and the storming of the Capitol and this mass purge, it viewed as a disaster, I think, for a lot of people in that Trump coalition, but it might not have been viewed that way for white nationalists themselves. For them, having been grouped together with Trump, surely a lot of you have seen the imagery from the Capitol. There you had the Tea Party flags, you had the Confederate flags, but you also had Camp Auschwitz. You had explicit white nationalist stuff mixed in there. They suddenly found themselves part of a coalition where they were kind of welcomed, or at least tolerated. I want to say welcomed, and I say that recognizing that there are real differences between different people in the Trump coalition. But on that day, white nationalists were kind of just part of it. They were not an isolated minority. They were not being purged or kept out. And that surely was emboldening to them. And it means that they're now, it's somewhat integrated into society, at least some section of society, whereas throughout most of the post-war history, they have been an isolated cell, especially, let's say, post-war Germany. They've been an isolated cell, and it's been easy for a governmental organization to crack down on them. That's going to become more difficult now. That to me, that's the most important thing to be taking out of the January 6th riots.
So as we're coming down on time, and I have to say the questions that folks have submitted, the thoughtfulness and the extent to which they could contribute to the quality of this conversation, I'm very impressed. So thank you all, and I'm so sorry we're not going to get to all of these. But I think one place to land that might I love the simplicity of this question. I'll just read it. What are you most fearful of? And I might add, based on your research, I assume they're asking, what are you seeing that is most troubling? What are you seeing that is most worrisome that we ought to pay attention to? I would just add, for a final point, what are you most hopeful about, based on your research as well, that we should be paying attention to?
The thing that scares me the most is what I was just talking about. I think we're in uncharted territory right now, where yes, there's a minority in the West. We're talking about a minority of our society, but it's a sizable minority, and its boundaries are newly porous. And as especially as these social media purges are taking place, it's one that's becoming also a known unknown to us. It's becoming invisible. I think that is really quite frightening. What makes me happy? It's funny. I got this question from a BBC journalist, and one is always it's always risky to be optimistic. That's why I respect optimists more than pessimists. It's much more dangerous. Could we imagine a parallel universe in which the protests that recently took place, these recent expressions of right-wing populism, did not even pay lip service to defending democratic institutions and liberal values? In other words, could we have imagined a storming of the Capitol that did not even bother to say that it was defending democracy? Yeah, we could. I could definitely imagine that, and it didn't happen. There is some sort of social investment in the continuation and in the virtue of democracy, and perhaps to a smaller extent, liberal democracy. And I think that's good. I'm going to be quick with these so that we can get to more questions, David. But those are the two things. Oh, you are muted.
You'd think after all this time.
No problem.
We occasionally make that mistake. Well, I mean, prior to closing us out here, because we've only got a few minutes, is there any, are there any resources you'd point folks towards if they want to explore this subject further in terms of scholarly, academic work, or journalistic resources that you think if folks want to dive deeper and understand more of the subject matter that you'd point folks towards?
Yes, I think that journalist Joshua Green is very good. I like what Thomas Chatterton Williams has to write about these issues. A wonderful sociologist, if anyone is interested in academic literature, is Kathleen Blee, who's spent a lot of time doing some really incredible ethnography, I think. Katrine Fangen in Norway. Also, those four really stand out, and there are plenty others, but I would actually recommend, though, in general, being careful with journalistic commentary on it. It's one of these rare subjects, again, that produces a lot of words with relatively little contact, with no consequences for making certain types of false statements. Especially if they elevate the criticism against these subjects. Journalists can do that and be wrong, and it will not matter to them in their career one tiny little bit. So I would steer clear of journalism. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then any final remarks before I close this out in terms of?
Yeah, I see so many interesting questions here. I can see some questions now that I'm just now seeing all of these. One thing that this is going to be responding to an anonymous attendee who asked I can't see the entire question, if my access would have been different had I not been a white male. One thing to bear in mind too is that as much as we talk about this as being an international movement, it still plays out within distinct nation states and societies that have their own histories and narratives of race, nation, gender. It all plays out differently. Brazil is extremely hard to get a grasp of whiteness and white identity in Brazil and just how it interacts with the nation. That's the preoccupation of generations of scholars. In my case, I think being a white male has helped me in many, many regards. What is more interesting to me is that in a lot of my experiences in Sweden, I was not considered a white male. During the first years when I was doing research, a blog popped up, the heading of which was racially suspect American doing research in Sweden. In their eyes, I was Jewish and something else. And this is by virtue of being in a society itself that, whose majority population has been exalted as being the whitest of all white people by pseudoscientific race biology for a long time, plus in a subsector of that society that is unusually invested in guarding the purity of that white population and that does not view me as part of it for various reasons, but foremost among them my last name and being obviously Jewish to them. So that the broader message of that is remember at the same time as this is an integrated global movement that it also plays out in different ways. There are localities and localisms that matter to it. Mike, David, yes.
It's okay. I'm on now. So, and I have to close this out because we're running up against the clock here, but just a few remarks to close us out. And the first, of course, is to thank you so much, Professor Teitelbaum, for joining us and sharing your expertise. This research is so fascinating and cuts across, so many of those things that are the political, the personal, the macro, and the micro. And I do hope that this has been, provocative and interesting for everyone who's attended, and that folks will be able to inquire, in a little bit more sophisticated and maybe more motivated way, given what we've learned based on your research. So thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your research with us. And thanks to everyone who joined for your time and attention, your participation, and your many excellent questions. I would also like to thank Emily Musumeci and Jeannie McDonald, who have been working behind the scenes here, helping sort questions and make sure the technical stuff is going well. So thanks so much to them for making this work smoothly. Everyone will receive an email shortly to a Google survey. That'll probably happen tomorrow. And we very much appreciate your feedback on this lecture. This is our first, the COVID year of doing this event virtually. We'll be planning for the fall series. So we really take your feedback seriously and let us know what you thought of this event and also of the series. And as I mentioned at the outset, a recording of this lecture will be available online on Monday. You can find that on the website where you registered for this event. So for the fall series, speakers and titles will be announced for that via our website and mailings this summer if you're on our mailing list. If you're not, you can, within that survey, the feedback survey, you can opt in to receive mailings and emails about future events. And I'll just close this out by saying thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all on the weekend again. Have a great day.